Hello, my name is Stacey Abrams, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to speak with you. I know the Skoll Foundation has a deep investment in justice here in the United States and around the world. And my commitment to justice has become part of the narrative around the work I do. But I want to begin a little earlier. You see, I didn't discover this intersection of racial justice and democracy in the wake of a 2018 campaign for governor. For me, this has been a lifelong lesson, a lifelong opportunity for learning and for action. You see, I grew up in southern Mississippi, in the working class poverty that so often pervades our communities. I was the daughter of parents who had grown up themselves in the deep and dire poverty of Mississippi, but who were determined to make better for their children. And while they did indeed improve our lot in life, my parents still couldn't escape the intersections, again, of racial injustice and the challenges of poverty and economic lack. My mom and dad wanted us to understand, though, that we had three jobs: go to church, go to school, and take care of each other. Go to church because they wanted us to be grounded in things that were larger than ourselves. They wanted us to have an ethic that guided us, that was not simply determined by our day-to-day interactions. They secondly wanted us to get an education, because for both of them, education had been transformative, leading each of them to pathways that their siblings and their family members could rarely experience. And third, they said take care of each other. It wasn't simply about doing good for my siblings or for my family, but it was about us going out into the world and doing good for others. Because my parents wanted us to understand that even though we too grappled with working class poverty, our job was larger than that. As my dad would put it, having nothing was not an excuse for doing nothing. And so from the earliest ages that I can remember, I was involved in the conversation about the intersection of racial justice and democracy. Because you see, my parents not only took us with them to volunteer, they took us with them to vote. And they wanted us to understand that voting and volunteering were two sides of the same coin, two sides of how we make progress in this country. They wanted us to volunteer because as individuals, volunteerism was the way we could touch the lives of others and make improvements. But voting was how we could build our collective power as a community to change the future. And I saw both at work, sometimes successfully and other times falling short. And that created my commitment to the intersection myself. You see, when I was a college student at Spelman College and HBCU in Atlanta, Georgia, I set up my first table to register my colleagues to vote because I knew that African-American students, that Black kids across the Atlanta University Center needed to have their voice heard because we were sitting in the middle of some of the most prestigious universities in the country, and we were surrounded by some of the most egregious poverty in our nation. And for me, the intersection was very clear. The difference between our communities and communities that had similar situations but had much better outcomes. I wanted to understand how volunteerism and voting were to be brought together. And that has been the work I've done ever since. I've done it through the nonprofit space, but I also understood that volunteerism cannot be limited to those who are simply trying to help on the nonprofit side. I worked in the for-profit sector, and I worked in government because I wanted to understand how each sector should have a role to play in how we change the future. But what we can never forget is that most of the challenges we face in this nation and abroad have a racial justice component, and that nothing has made that more clear in the 21st century than the COVID pandemic. The COVID pandemic unveiled for so many who had been able to ignore it the disparities that exist in our healthcare system, in our justice system, and in our economic system. But the solutions are also there. In our healthcare system, as we watch the deployment of the COVID vaccine, it is incumbent upon us to understand that hesitancy around a vaccine is not an excuse for a lack of access. And the work that we do through my organization, Fair Count, and through the Southern Economic Advancement Project, a second group that I created, is focused on making sure that we do not allow government to avoid its responsibility by blaming racial injustice for people's inaction. Because we know that for often these communities, it's not simply a lack of information, it's a lack of access. And we have to be very focused as we try to recover from COVID-19 to ensure that access to the vaccine, access to medication, access to services is not impeded by a false notion that communities of color simply do not want to be helped. That racial injustice that exists in our healthcare system is not going to dissipate once the vaccine is deployed. It is a warning call, a clarion call for action. The second issue that we have to pay attention to, of course, is the economic impact. We know that the communities hardest hit by the COVID-19 pandemic economically are the ones that are least likely to be able to be resilient. We have to address the inequities in our education system and in our economic system that position so many communities of color to be so hard hit, but to also be so fragile in their ability to respond. As we think about investments, as we think about recovery, we cannot ignore the infrastructure that allowed the COVID-19 economic recession to devastate so many communities. But one good thing we have seen, of course, is the American Rescue Plan has an intention of lifting up millions of Americans out of poverty, including half of the children who are currently in poverty. But what we must be concerned about is the short-term nature of the American Rescue Plan and the long-term effects of child poverty. The third revelation that came about in 2020 and 2021 for so many people because of COVID is the long-standing, centuries-old challenge of racial injustice in our criminal justice system. We know that it is not simply a question of the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, Rayshard Brooks, and the list goes on. It's also a conversation of a justice system that allows injustice to be determined by your race. Because it's not simply the murders of these men and women. It's who is arrested, who is charged, who is sentenced, who is released, and what do they come back to when they return to society. We have large conversations that must be had in 2021 and beyond. And I know that it is not just about having good organizations investing in those groups trying to do the work through voluntarism. We have to do the work through voting. And that is why democracy is at the core of the work that I do. Whether it's through the economic project or counting good people, counting all people, or the work that we do with Fair Fight, we have the responsibility to ensure that every voice is heard. Because as my parents understood, it was our responsibility to work our hands to lift communities up, but it was also our responsibility to cast our votes to change the future. For too many organizations, there is a division between the work that we do in the nonprofit space and the work that has to be done in the democracy space. But I would argue that these jobs are intertwined and are indelibly linked, inextricably linked together because of the reality that if policies continue to foment that undermine racial justice, we will never have a democracy worthy of its name. But I believe that we have seen through the action of social entrepreneurs, through groups like Fair Fight, Fair Count, and the Southern Economic Advancement Project, we have seen pathways to create the ecosystems of good. But these ecosystems have to understand each other, have to relate to one another, and have to challenge one another for better. The triumvirate I use is this. The first job is investigation. We are obliged to understand not simply the headlines, but the footnotes. We have to go into communities that are so often left in the shadows or left out of the conversation because their problems don't seem big enough. But too often, those are the problems that seep into the entirety of our ecosystem, and we have to address them. And so when we think about the issue of access to justice, it's where are the lawyers and what happens to elect the leaders who make decisions about who gets access to diversionary programs and who's simply thrown into jail and with the key thrown away. It's also about making sure that we understand fundamentally and at our core that the work we do not only has to be investigated, it has to be experimented. We are so timid sometimes about implementing programs that don't have proven outcomes. But as we face new challenges, as we uncover new impediments, it is incredibly important that we invest in organizations that are willing to experiment, to try new and different. The entrepreneurial aspect of the work done by the Skoll Foundation and others has to be expanded and grounded in this reality that sometimes the answers will only come about because of failure. And we have to invest in the possibility of failure. That's all experimenting is. If we investigate and we experiment, then what we can do then is analyze and iterate. We have to be willing to take these things to scale, but also we have to be willing to franchise them to other communities. Because the fundamental reality is that the challenges we face with the intersection of racial injustice and democracy look different depending on where you live. If we're grounded in the United States, we have 50 different democracies. And if we expand to a worldview, we know that we have nation states and communities that could benefit from learning what happened. That what Grameen Bank accomplished can be applied to economic poverty in Mississippi, and that what we have done in Georgia on democracy can possibly be of benefit in Myanmar. As we think about the work of racial justice and democracy, we have to remember that this work preceded us and will continue after us. But our obligation, our opportunity, is to do the best we can to investigate, to experiment, and to iterate. And that is how together we bring racial democracy and racial justice into harmony. Thank you so much.